symptoms of a trauma bond that you might see when you are assessing your client or they're talking about it is some symptoms of PTSD. Not, as we know, not everybody who has trauma experiences end up with PTSD. But generally speaking, my experience has been that when I have individuals who are in these toxic relationships and have found themselves in it for many, many years, they probably do have PTSD, and they probably have CPTSD, which is, oh my God, I just lost my train of thought. Continuous post-traumatic stress disorder. So that's just experiencing trauma continuously over periods of time. Okay. The other thing is experiencing complex PTSD. I don't know where my brain went. So they also experience this strong emotional bond with the perpetrator, that it's different from the bonds that they have with other people in their lives. They are grateful for small acts of kindness whenever the perpetrator does something. You know, they bring that up in session. They'll talk about, oh, well, Sally or Bob or whoever, bought this book on being nicer in relationships, or they went to a seminar, or they said they're going to start going to church. All of these things are sucking in the survivor. Okay. They're meant to do that. They have no intention. The toxic person has no intention of doing any of it, but they know how to throw out these things in order to keep that person under their control. You will probably hear some denying of the abuse or rationalizing it. Like believing that they deserve the abuse or they're the one with the problem, that kind of thing. They're hyper-focused all the time on what the perpetrator needs and what the perpetrator wants. They're accepting and agreeing with the perpetrator's point of view most of the time. They're acting in ways that are contrary to their own values to appease the perpetrator. They're perceiving anyone who encourages them to escape from this abusive relationship as the enemy. Now, that isn't usually the therapist, okay? But it can be other family members, other friends, other, people in their life that are saying, you've got to get out of this. This is not good for you. And so that you might hear that they've said that in the past. My experience is they don't typically do that once we sort of get down into it in the therapy. They're not resistant to that necessarily, but it is a process. It takes time to untangle. And then they have difficulty leaving the relationship for fear of retaliation from the perpetrator. Now, retaliation doesn't necessarily mean they're physically fearful of something happening. It can, but that the perpetrator is going to go tell everybody that they're a terrible parent or a terrible partner or a terrible worker, or they're going to do a smear campaign of them throughout their neighborhood or throughout their community. And these are legitimate because the perpetrator will do that. But that keeps that person in the bond. Okay. So let's look at a couple of things with the neurochemical response and then the neurobiological response. Like I mentioned it before, but there are things at work here that we have no control over, meaning our brain is responding in particular ways when we're in an abusive relationship, when our client's in an abusive relationship. And it's helpful to know this because it helps the client understand that it's not, like I said before, that it's not because they're terrible. It's not because they're weak. It's not because they don't know any better. It's not because they're stupid. It's because there's an actual response going on in your brain when you're in situations like this. So the neurochemical cycle of abuse is that repeated experiences of abuse or trauma can affect the brain chemistry and like we talked about before, and leads to this chemical addiction-like behavior, okay? The cycle involves these different neurochemicals. So cortisol, which we know is a stress hormone that's released in response to trauma. When you're repeatedly exposed to repeated exposure to cortisol can lead to increased anxiety and other mental health issues. Dopamine, a neurotransmitter, that's associated with pleasure and reward. When there's abuse, the brain can become addicted to dopamine, to that rush that comes from the cycle of abuse and reconciliation, okay? Oxytocin, a hormone that's released during bonding and intimacy. In abuse cases, the abuser, like we talked about with the intermittent reinforcement, uses affection and intimacy as a way to manipulate and control the victim. Wendy says, my experience is that the abuser is the sole arbiter of the person's self-esteem and self-worth who's in a relationship. Yes, 100%. The abuser's opinion is the most important thing, as is everybody else's, by the way, not just the abuser. And that's a whole nother issue that we'll get into as we move along. Endorphins, neurotransmitters that are released in response to pain. When there's abuse cases, the victim experiences this high. That's what we were talking about before. And then over time, all of these neurochemicals become imbalanced, and it leads to this cycle of addiction-like behaviors in which the person becomes trapped. And a lot of times what I tell clients is, you know, I'll relate it to like a person who's an alcoholic or a person who's an addict. Every alcoholic and addict that I've ever met and worked with in my lifetime knows logically they should not be doing that because there's consequences, because it's ruining their life, because it's bad, whatever it is. But because of this cycle, the brain tells them essentially, yeah, but I can control it. So I'm going to go in there and I'm going to have one drink, or I'm going to just shoot up one time or take that one pill, and I'm going to be good because I can manage it. If I do something and change what I'm doing, I can control the abuser's response to me. That's what this is, okay? And so that's why it's so difficult to get out of it, because we've got all these things working, you know, against logic and reason and all of this sort of things. Okay, so let's look at the neurobiological response, because that was the neurochemical. So there's the neurobiological. There's a few things that are working here. First is the prefrontal cortex. That's the executive functioning part of our brain. And it works with the amygdala to regulate emotions and behavior. It helps us to accomplish goals and have abstract thinking and self-control and all that sort of stuff. So normal functioning brains have a prefrontal cortex that's wired to counteract over excitation in the amygdala. But brains that experience PTSD have a lower functioning prefrontal cortex. Patients that have PTSD, research shows, frequently experience a decrease in the volume of the ventral media prefrontal cortex, which is a region in the brain that plays a role in regulating emotions and restraining impulsive behavior. And this explains why people that have PTSD often feel overwhelmed by stress and anxiety in instances where they're actually not in danger, okay, which is what happens in individuals in toxic relationships. The amygdala, which is the center for emotions and regulates emotions, memories, and survival instincts, basically. When a person is presented with a harmful stimulus from the environment, what the amygdala does, it reacts by alerting your body's fight, flight, or freeze response. So when that happens, that increases, or what happens is when a person experiences a stressful event, the amygdala releases the norepinephrine, which results in an increased heart rate and that elevated state of arousal. And individuals with PTSD often experience more activity in their amygdala. And this results in more of a reactive startle response. So the individuals that you're working with have a higher not stress level, but they're always in a state of stress. They're always in a state of agitation. And that's where they sort of exist. So their nervous system is overactivated. And so this results in more neuroepinephrine being released in the body. And when this happens, when there's too much adrenaline, there's no logical reasoning, or reasoning starts to become not quite as logical. as it might have been prior to having something happen. So this damage to the amygdala inhibits the person's ability to experience fear, okay? So contrary to the hyperactive amygdala, which contributes to impulsive behavior, a hypoactive amygdala is a problem because the person is less likely to appropriately respond when they're in danger. Does empathetic and neurological understanding help for therapists who still do talk therapy? 100%, because you're going to move this into dialogue that clients can understand, which means that, and it segues into understanding that we're talking about this neurobiological or neurochemical response that they don't have control over, meaning that if they have experienced trauma, their body is responding a particular way, their brain is responding a particular way. So what they can do, because they can't control how their brain is going to respond to trauma, is think about what they need to do to reduce being in situations that may increase trauma, which in the case of what we're talking about today is being in relationships where people are abusive to them. And then another area that real quickly that we want to touch on is the hippocampus. And this plays a part in mediating stress and fear. So it plays a role in cognition and learning and retrieval of memories and stuff like that. But when a person undergoes trauma, they may be triggered by environments that resemble the place the trauma occurred. So this is the triggering piece. The association is due to this hippocampus, which helps us differentiate the present from the past. So when people feel stressed, the hypothalamus releases this hormone called cortisol, which we talked about a minute ago, which helps regulate our response to stress. High levels of cortisol are thought to damage hippocampal cells. Okay, so brain scans show that people with PTSD, with chronic stress, because that's what happens with PTSD, have hippocampal damage. And this reduces the size and the function. So smaller hippocampi contribute to this trauma survivors experiencing difficulties when attempting to recall past events and to be able to separate stressful experiences from current situations. So what this means as it relates to our clients is that, one, you've probably heard this, that clients, a lot of times who've experienced trauma, and particularly childhood trauma, can't remember anything that went on. They don't have memories of childhood or experiences in their childhood, which is fine. They don't have to remember them. Again, the answer to the question about do you have to go through specific things with a client? No, you don't. But this is the reason why. And because they may have reactions while you're talking to them, working with them, in which they give a fear response or what we call a trauma response when they're not actually in danger, but they feel like they're in danger, okay? So when I'm hearing clients that are talking about that kind of thing, I am actually thinking, okay, this person probably has more trauma going on or had trauma going on than they've reported. So I want to be very careful about addressing that as we move along, that this is not just, oh, you picked the wrong partner, oh, sorry, you have this narcissistic or manipulative parent or neighbor or coworker or whatever it is. This is the result of damage that occurred due to trauma in the past. Okay, and then I just threw this in for y'all so you see the fight, flight, freeze. Fight, aggressively confront the threat. Flight, we run away or hide from the threat. Freeze, we numb or are unable to move or act against the threat. And fawn, which is appease or comply with the threat to avoid conflict. This is what you're getting a lot of in the relationships we're talking about today, the fawn piece.